Hello everybody and welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well, and today we'll be talking about the Spider-Man No Way Home box office and how it could potentially be the second best domestic opening of all time, surpassing that of Avengers Infinity War, which is, when you think about it, pretty insane, especially after all of the narratives that have been shoved down our throats for the past 2 years, especially for the past year, with the pandemic being used for every single excuse as to why big budget films, especially MCU films and other giant budget properties, have failed. And obviously Spider-Man is proving those narratives wrong, and that if you actually provide a product that people want to see, if you actually provide a product that gives fans what they want, that actually provides fan service, or at the very least gives the prospect of fan service, guess what? People will show up, especially within that very coveted 18 to 34 demographic, though, of course, we know if you've been to the theater that this is a movie that is reaching out to countless other demographics and countless other groups of people as well. Before we get going into the story, please make sure, though, you smash that like button, have that fire button if you're watching over on Odyssey, and also make sure you're subscribed to the channel with that bell notification turned on. That way you know every time a new video or live stream goes live on the channel. Obviously, this is going to be a story that we're going to be covering a lot here on the channel as the numbers continue to come in, because this is a movie that had actually a much better Saturday and is expected to have had a much better Sunday, so that the number that we got, the $587 million worldwide total, could end up being actually a little bit higher, because the Sunday number is actually looking to have been a little bit stronger, which is why they're now talking about this film having the second best opening just behind Endgame. And Endgame obviously was a huge event film that was 20 plus, films in the making, right, and all that other nonsense. But also at the same time, the reason why we're seeing that this movie will not get to the Endgame levels is because Endgame had a domestic total of like around $350 million. So this film's not going to get close to that as far as the opening weekend is concerned, but this film is going to be giving tons of other movies a run for their money, especially in the total box office earnings by the end of its run, as this film, having already made $587 million and likely could be adjusted to be over $600 million for its opening weekend, could easily make it to $1 billion within the next couple of weeks. I suspect the film will be over $750 million by the end of next weekend, especially with the holidays coming up, and could actually reach $1 billion before the end of fiscal year, or rather not fiscal year, but the end of year 2021. So let's go ahead and go into this update from the shills over at Deadline, who are going to try and not remind you of how many times they used the pandemic as an excuse, about how even just a week ago they were using this as an excuse as to why West Side Story is a flop and failure financially. And now, of course, they are trying to, again, try and raise their own clout here. And it says, given the Sunday night estimates we're hearing for Spider-Man No Way Home, it looks like the Sony Marvel movie, Sony of course getting primary billing there. Some people are still getting triggered by that, by the way. And for those that are still getting triggered, hey, thank you. Really, honestly, thank you. It just makes me happy. Anyway, is on the verge of overtaking Disney Marvel's. Again, notice how Disney Marvel's Infinity War versus Sony Marvel, because again, it's a Sony product. Spider-Man is owned by Sony. Hashtag Sony owns Spider-Man. And also, Peter Parker is Spider-Man. That triggers some people as well. Infinity War as the second best domestic opening of all time, with 257.6 to 260 million now being the projection for the domestic opening for this movie. Infinity War opened in the final weekend of April 2018 to $257.6 million, and they say they're going to wait for Sony to officially call the new record in the morning, but it looks very promising. And so basically, based on the estimates, they are suspecting that the number is not going to be as big of a drop. So originally they said that the movie was going to be 22% down from Saturday. So again, that's a Saturday to Sunday drop. So they expected it to be around 22%. However, they are hearing from industry sources that it was actually closer to a 12 to 16% drop, which is insane. That would mean that the actual film, compared to Saturday's estimated 73.8, made somewhere around $61 to $64 million, which again would put it in that 257 to $260 million range. Just as a frame of reference, when the numbers originally came out for the movie, they were having this film at $253 million. So again, that would be adding another $7 million or so to that number. And that would, of course, put this film in the 590 range. And if they make similar adjustments to some of their foreign totals over the next couple of days, Again, I would not be surprised to see this film get past that $600 million mark, which again is insane, especially when you're reminded of how much fear-mongering has been done this past year, how much excuses have been made for all of the films that have failed this year, and how, again, all those narratives are being blown up. And that's why this news is so exciting to me. I know there's a lot of people out there that are still sour on anything associated with the MCU, even though this film has, very little connection as far as financially to the MCU, with only 25% of the production budget actually even coming from Disney. I understand completely, though, why people are having some issues overall with wanting to support this movie. But to me, as I've said, it's not really the movie necessarily that is the most important aspect of this. It is the event. It is the fact that you see right here, right, a crowded theater here in Valencia, California, and I'm pretty sure I'm seeing some people in there without masks on, by the way, which don't forget they just had another mask mandate put in over in the state of California. So it's just really awesome to see people showing up, defying in many ways some of these draconian measures, these violations of human rights, and that I think is always something that's amazing and is always something that is worth commending and is always worth something to praise because of that very reason. It says, anecdotally, I went to see Spider-Man No Way Home tonight at Multiplex 28 miles north of Hollywood early today when I was looking to buy tickets to a prime evening showing. It appeared unlikely as Fandango kept timing out. By 4:30, there was only one seat left. However, 3 seats surfaced at the Regal, which had a 7:50 show filled to the brim. So again, this movie is showing up everywhere. This movie is performing incredibly well everywhere, and this is a film that is going to be one of the biggest films of all time and is, again, breaking down those pandemic records. Now, one thing I did want to touch on a little bit because some people had some questions about it, and so I figured I would give a little explanation because, some people are new to the channel, so they don't really know exactly how my numbers break down. Basically, when it comes to the box office, when we talk about a film's budget, right? So that's the reported budget given to us by the studios. So for Spider-Man No Way Home, the reported budget was around $200 million. When you take into account marketing, typical rule of thumb, and again, you can look up your own resources for this, but typical rule of thumb is you take the budget, multiply it by 1.5, and that's about typically what most studios will spend as far as marketing budget is concerned, meaning that the film's total cost is probably for this film around $300 million. You then take into account the fact that they need to make around the studios only get usually around 60% of the end result. So by the end of a film's theatrical run, the studios get about 60% of that final number. So let's say the film made $1 billion. The studio's take on that film would be around $600 million, whereas the rest of the money would end up going to the theaters, right? And then also to take into account that when you release a film overseas, usually sometimes those countries have different deals as well. For instance, in China, when you release there with those communists, they take 75% of the entire box office, and so you only get about 25% return. So when everything is said and done, typically the studios is left with around 60% of the actual money left over. You then have to, of course, with that, subtract the amount of money they spent on the project, and that's what gives you your net gain or net loss. So when you take all of those things into account, for the entirety of the MCU this year, just based on the box office numbers themselves, the films had a negative, again, a net loss of $98 million. So that is the entire loss for the MCU this year, with Black Widow losing around $72 million, Eternals $60 million, and Shang-Chi actually making around $34.3 million in net profit. Now, some people will mention, what about the Disney Plus numbers? Well, remember that Disney settled a lawsuit with Scarlett Johansson for an undisclosed amount of money, and some experts were saying that it could have been around $40 million or so, amongst other things, other contracts, things like that. So really, when you look at that number, a lot of that money, a lot of that cash has kind of gotten eaten into. Also, you have to remember that Shang-Chi was reported as having a $150 million budget, but there were other places reporting that the budget was actually $200 million. And so when you take that into account, it really ends up kind of being a wash. And so therefore, this number is probably the most accurate that we have. And this is also just the MCU. When you take into account the other Disney releases, so the animated releases especially, this number jumps to be around $400 million in net losses. So again, just for people wondering about that. Whereas in the case of Sony's films, obviously Sony had other film releases this year. They're still at a net positive for the year. But out of just Spider-Man No Way Home, of which they get 75% of the returns because they put in 75% of the money, and Venom 2, where they get 100% of the returns because they were the only ones that were actually producing that film. They did not split that film with Disney at all. They get 100% on the returns of that, which means that right now the worldwide box office for both of those films together was around $1 billion, and they get obviously 186.1 so far million net gain profit just from those two films. When you break into account, or rather break down the fact that Sony and Disney are splitting the number for Spider-Man No Way Home, those net profits, which right now stand at 52.3 million, split to Sony taking 39.2 million and Disney taking $13 million. So again, that's after taking into account the 60% that the studios get by the end of the run, subtracting the amount of money that was spent on the project, and then you have the net gain, and then you split that 75-25 between Sony and Disney, and that's how you get to that final number, which makes this number the adjusted financial loss for Disney at this point in time with that extra 13 million they've made. So this number is going to go up, right, as the days go by. And again, this is going to be something where Disney is going to see a sizable amount of money come from. The issue is that it's got a lot of money to make up, and this is just the MCU. So even if it does break even with the MCU this year because of Spider-Man No Way Home, it's still going to have another $300 million or so that it had lost from other films, and that's just for calendar year 2021. When you take into account all films since the beginning of the pandemic, it gets even worse. Keep in mind, the movie Onward lost around $200 million for them because that was the first film that was hit during the beginning of the pandemic times. So we're talking about a studio that has had a lot of financial losses at the box office. This is not taking into account any other revenue streams, and so obviously one could argue that they've made this up in other areas. But as far as pure box office is concerned, Disney has had a very big problem, and that's the reason why when we look to the success of Spider-Man, this is a real win for Sony. Yeah, it's going to help offset the losses, the major losses that Disney has had this year, especially within their MCU, but it's not going to be enough for them to offset just, again, the huge losses that they have, whereas with Sony, they have actually ended the year at a net gain, net positive, and I'll have a video probably later on this week breaking down how the studios did this year overall. But Sony right now is the most successful studio of the year, with really one of the few studios to have net gains. And this film alone, Spider-Man, is going to lead to them having some of the biggest box office of the year, no question about it. But just want to put this update out there. Again, do you think that Spider-Man is going to be able to dethrone the release of Infinity War? It's going to be really interesting to follow this movie, especially since we're going to have to, of course, adjust this film for inflation. In fact, if we can go ahead and pull this up real quick, I like doing these things live. Always like to do things live if we possibly can. But let me see if we can actually find Infinity War on here, because what we can do with this is we can actually compare the two films. So obviously Infinity War costs a lot more, but one thing I like about the numbers is that you can actually click this little button up here, and then it adjusts the numbers for inflation. And so as we can see, if we look at these numbers, for the adjusted for inflation numbers, put Infinity War at $259 million for its opening weekend, meaning that if this film gets closer to that $260 million mark, this film, even adjusted for inflation, could end up being the second largest opening of all time, beating Avengers Infinity War, which, if anyone was going to say that the film was going to beat Avengers Infinity War, even just a week ago, people would be laughing in your face. Why? Because they would be using the pandemic. And now that that excuse doesn't work anymore because it has been blown to pieces by this film's release, it's great to see. Anyway, what are your thoughts about this? Do you think it's going to end up beating Avengers Infinity War? Obviously, this is going to be a film that's going to be very fun to watch. By the end of its run, Avengers Infinity War ended around $677 million domestically. This film could theoretically give that movie a run for its money, or at the very least could have a very strong showing. And also, do you think that this is a movie that could end up being not just a $1 billion film, but maybe even at this point, I think it's worth talking about being a $1.5 to $2 billion film? I think it's in the cards now, at the very least, for this movie, especially with it going kind of toe-to-toe with a other $2 billion film in Avengers Infinity War. So let me know your thoughts about this in the comments section down below. If you like this video, smash that like button, loud that fire button. It really does mean a lot. You're all amazing, beautiful people. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.
And now for a huge shout out to all of my December Patreon Subscribe Star and Locals members. Animation commentator Brandon, Brian P., Christopher Bowman, Dolores Ed, Dion, Father Christopher Miller, Hail to you, Father, Father Damian Cook, Garrett Searles, Hannibal Grimm, Harold Francis, Inflamed Wood, Jacob Juice, Jeff Toon, Joe Horn, Jonathan Carney, Gomer Kyles 79, Laura, The Modern Major General's Story, Mike Jackson ×4, Mitch Dunaway, Mad Mitch Dunaway, Mr. Peabody, Mondo Spieler, On to June, Orange Chat Reviews, Out of Step with Reality, Priscilla Hall, Rosetta Ullen, Stan Andrian, Teresa Martin, Theodore Bendon, and Tina Bojan, and of course, the Empress of the Universe, Tina B. Thank you very much for being my Patreon members. And for my Subscribe Star members, UAB Mad Dog, Mike Jackson, Storm Tracker, The R, Fast Reaction, Nosferatu Gatsu, Stan 4, John B., Mr. Roy, Glinzer, J. Alex McCarthy Jr., Dean Heiss / the new number 2, J-Rod, the Beer Guru, and the K-Man. Thank you very much for supporting me on Subscribestar. And to my 4 members over on Locals.com, Kara Tharp, UAB Mad Dog, once again, Mike Jackson, Bifford a Hobbit, and Robert Barnes. Thank you for supporting me on Locals. And if you want to have your name shouted out at the end of every video and live stream, check out the top link in the video description below. It's called Willow or .w.lo, Willow link. It'll bring you to all of my social media platforms and also to all of the various other locations that you can support the channel. You can get access to things like giveaways, where I do giveaways of 4K films, 4K steelbooks, digital codes, all kinds of stuff every single month. Also, there's a level where you get access to all of that, plus an exclusive podcast that I do with John the Flick Pick Flickinger, where you also get to ask questions that we will answer on every episode of the podcast. And at the final level, you also have the ability, the Chosen of Valhalla level, you have the ability to have all of that, plus in your first month, get a free t-shirt of your choice, any color, sent anywhere in the world, and also you get to be featured once a month on the Chosen of Valhalla live stream featured on the main channel. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, check out the link in the description. You're all amazing and beautiful people. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, God bless.